Okay, I'm good.
Yep.
Welcome to Live Network's episode with Lilliput Press. I'm here today to talk with Martina Devlin about some of the Lilliput titles from this year. Martina, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Well, it's a pleasure. I get to talk about books. What's not to like?
Yes, for both of us. We have 3 titles that we're going to talk about today, one from Adrian Duncan, one from Kevin Power, and then your own, Edith. And I think I would like to start with Edith, if you don't mind. This is the book, and this is based on the writer Edith Somerville of Somerville and Ross, which some people may know of and some people may not. They wrote together and under pseudonyms, but essentially two female writers collaborating. I guess a lot of people would know The Real Charlotte. I know that comes up a lot in college contexts and other contexts. And maybe you can talk a little bit about first maybe their relationship and who they were. And I'd be definitely keen to know for you where this story began.
Well, Edith was one half of the writing duo Somerville and Ross, and in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were hugely successful. They were commercially successful, but also critically so, and made a fair bit of money from their writing. It was highly unusual, this idea of a female writing duo. They used the nom de plume Somerville and Ross, though it was a nom de plume for Violet Martin, Edith's second cousin and really lifelong friend. And Edith described the moment when she met Martin, as she called her, Violet Martin or Ross, as a hinge moment. It just seemed to be like an electrical charge that each of them plugged into. And they wrote all sorts of novels, including The Real Charlotte, which is a great Victorian novel. They wrote 3 short story collections, which is perhaps their best known work, the Irish RM series. People maybe know it today because of the 1980s television series, which appears to be constantly repeated in some part of the world or on some TV station. And they also wrote travel books and journalism, and Edith was a really good artist, and in many ways, if she hadn't met Martin, perhaps she'd have become an artist like relatives of hers. And there are examples of her work in various collections, in the family home in Drishane House in Castle Townsend in West Cork, and also people have sketches of her. Sometimes readers, since the book came out, have sent me images of Edith's work, because she was a very generous woman, was often asked to donate things for church bazaars and fetes, and she'd do what she called a dirt, a very quick sketch, and it would be auctioned off. So she had a long life. She lived into she lived until 1949, when she was in her early 90s, and worked for most of that period. I became fascinated by her because I visited Castle Townsend in West Cork. It's near Skibbereen. And I went to the most beautiful little church there, a Church of Ireland church called St. Barahans on a hill overlooking the sea. And Edith is buried there, and next to her is buried Violet Martin Ross. And it's impossible to be in Castle Townsend and not be conscious of her, partly because Drishane House is on the hill there and is still lived in by Somervilles, partly because of Edith, who funneled a great deal of the money she earned from writing into keeping this wonderful old house shipshape, and was always insistent that the family should live there. And this is important because it was at a time when various big house families, the gentry, if you like, were leaving Ireland because of the War of Independence and the Civil War, and the big houses were being burned out. And it's at that period that the book is set.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time period to look at for all of the reasons that you've just listed. And I suppose I thought from reading it that there's a lot in it really about the role of the writer, the role of the artist, excuse me, what it means to be alive in a particular time, which I guess, you know, for us, we are here, and like you say, you visit a place and you're making a connection then with an old story, but that had a whole kind of energy of its own. And I marked a kind of a page where Edith is having a conversation with Shaw, and she says, perhaps if you weren't an artist, you'd have been a reformer. Is there anything you miss about Ireland, George? And he says, I miss everything about it, but I can't live there. I'm amazed you still stick to the place. And she says, it's home. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, I guess, in the writing of the book. What were the things that were standing out to you as being very important to this person and this character?
Oh, a love of home was really important. It's interesting you should have picked that out, because Edith saw Ireland warts and all, and still loved the place. She was very clear that her identity was Irish. She drew a lot of her inspiration from Castle Townsend and the surrounding area, and it's quite recognizable in her work. And perhaps people think how odd when I say it's very clear her identity was Irish. She was part of that hyphenated culture, the Anglo-Irish, and there was this notion of allegiance first to empire and to Britain. But Edith didn't feel that. She felt that Ireland was where she belonged, and she really wanted the family there. I came across a letter during the research which she sent to one of her brothers. She had 5 brothers, and they all were functionaries of empire in the army or the navy. And she wrote to one saying, "What's this nonsense where you call yourself English? You're not English. British if you must, or Irish, but you're not English. You were born on the island of Ireland." So she was very clear about this idea of identity. And the other thing I noticed about her was, following on from this letter, she'd come up with the concept of hybrid identity. Now, she wrote this letter at the beginning of the 1920s, and it took decades more for some of the great diplomatic and political brains to come up with the notion of hybrid identity for the Good Friday Agreement. British and Irish, both either. And yet this woman in a remote part of West Cork, who didn't have a great deal of education, clearly she was a clever woman, but she only had 1 year at school, the rest of the time it was governesses, which could be patchy. This woman understood it from somewhere deep inside herself, and I thought that was fascinating. Now, any gardener will tell you about the importance of hybridity. Darwin wrote about hybrid vigor. But Edith put this into words in terms of identity, and I think it's very important for Ireland because of our checkered history. So that fascinated me about her, that she understood something instinctively.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention before we move on, I suppose it's interesting, it's, you know, Edith, a novel, and while it's based on history and historical events, you chose to go at it in the novel form and not in kind of strictly non-fiction form. And I think for readers, that's great, because I found it to be very readable and personable, and there's a warmth in it that I think sometimes is missing if you go the kind of the non-fiction route. But I just wanted to ask, why for you did you choose the novel? Was there any question of that in the beginning, or you know, what space did that give you between your own writing and the research to be able to try and bring this woman to life and her life and her connections?
There's magic in fiction.
Mm.
So I had to be free to imagine conversations. I mean, there's a lot of material in the archive about Edith Somerville because she was a Victorian lady, and I use the term lady advisedly. You know, she was a lady and not somebody who came from a different walk of life. So that both gave her opportunities, but also restricted her. In fact, just going off at a tangent, that's why the relationship with Martin was so important to her. As a single woman, she couldn't travel on her own at that time. With Martin, they were able to gad about different places and write about it, and they were kind of it was respectable for them to be together in a way that it wasn't for Edith to be on her own. So yeah, Victorian lady, lots of letters. You know, she wrote multiple letters every day, and she kept a diary for most of her life. And also then the manuscripts are held in various archives, mostly in Queen's University in Belfast, where they look after them very well, and people like me had access to them, and others will, of course. There's also a private archive in Drishane House in Cork, a little museum of her possessions. And that's where I differ as a novelist from an historian, because the possessions really bring her to life for me. Riding boots, an easel, a portable easel for sketching outdoors. Art was very important to all her life. A huge sun hat out to here. So seeing these objects, it just helps to breathe life into a character. So I loved that. And then I loved when I'd look at her letters and notes, there'd often be doodles down the side. She loved dogs. She had wee dogs all her life. She loved horses too. But you'd often stumble across a sketch of one of her little dogs in the margins. And there's a letter from her from Paris, where she's seen Oscar Wilde walk down the street, and she does a little graffito of him where he's walking along holding a lily, one single lily, arm outstretched, and she thinks he looks terribly silly and draws it for the person that she's sending the letter to. I say the person, but of course letters were passed around then, so sometimes she'd put on a page, you know, don't show this page, and she'd say something gossipy in it. But there was this big sense of a big warm, sometimes rackety family where they'd all share their news, and they were scattered around the empire as well. So all this material, yes, I could have written a biography of her. Better people than me have written much better biographies than I could have. I just wanted to bring her to life in a way that I don't really believe you can with biography. And that's not to be disrespectful to biographers who do a really important job. I mean, people like me come along then and benefit from their work. It's, you know, it really does matter. But if you want to just puff the breath of life into someone, fiction is the way to do it. And there's more truth in fiction than you can find in cold hard history.
Yeah, because they are quite static. Well,
And
I think
see, the other thing you can do is, you know, the what of a person's life. Okay, you know the kind of key points, but what you don't always know is the why, the gaps in the middle. And as a fiction writer, you can then speculate.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it, and it's a great book, Martina. So well done on it.
Thank you.
And I encourage people.
My hope is that, forgive me for cutting across you, my hope is that it'll encourage people to go and read Somerville and Ross again. Because writers fall in and out of favour. And although their Irish RM stories are still remembered, sometimes taught, and The Real Charlotte is, there's much more work, including a solo novel which Edith wrote after Martin's death called The Big House of Inver, which I think is a cracking one, and has a very strong female protagonist who's illegitimate at a time when such a term had legal resonance. And I was so brave of her to do this.
Well, even, their whole relationship is very interesting, and their individual work and collaborative work is really interesting. So I think a lot of people may be interested to go and explore that. Okay, let's go on to, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, sorry, you can't stop me when I get on my specialist subject here, Edith, and I do apologize. Your listeners may also be interested to know that she collaborated with Martin beyond the grave, or believed she did, because she did automatic writing or trance writing every day of her life, virtually, after Martin died in 1915. And she insisted on continuing to use the dual signature. She was convinced that Martin was advising her on plot and character. Now, this was quite audacious because it gave her permission to keep going with a very successful brand. Perhaps after Martin's death, when they were at the height of their powers, she wouldn't have had a market writing as Edith Somerville. But as, you know, by insisting on her right to use the Somerville and Ross dual signature, by this kind of device she came up with, she continued to have a career. So now her publisher and her agent didn't really believe her, but they went along with it because it created mystery, and mystery is good for business.
Okay, Kevin Powers' book, The Written World, it is non-fiction. It's an interesting one. He's talking about the relationship between critical writing and then the writing itself, and the relationship of reviewing and writing, which he's done both.
Yes, I have it here. Do you have it?
I don't have a copy on the desk.
Yes, I have it here. I'm pleased to say, just in case you didn't, so people can see it. Yes, well, I love essays anyway. It's essays and reviews. So since 2008, Kevin, who's a very well-known novelist, and he also lectures at Trinity College in creative writing. But since then, he's reviewed almost 350 books. And he's making a case for the importance of criticism, that criticism honors art, and that the critic is not setting out to destroy. He says, you know, the bad review isn't very often. Sometimes it is, I would argue, but he says it's hardly ever written out of mere spite, that the motivation is disappointment. So critics are people who love art and hate to see it badly represented. But what I love about this collection is his prose. He has a very crisp style and a knack for finding the telling phrase or the right word, and he makes me laugh. He really does. I think the book repays close attention, the essays and the reviews and so forth. He's punchy, he's witty, and his opinions are considered on an array of subjects, whether Greta Thunberg or Norman Mailer, all sorts of people. It's particularly notable for the opening essay on failure, which is a meditation sharing personal experience on how failure is hardwired into a writer's life. And I think that essay in particular ought to be mandatory reading for anyone hoping to be published. But look, his turn of phrase, I think, is what many people will latch on to. One that I've memorized is, and not because I plan to rob it, Kevin, is our money glazed post everything century. Or, you know, it just sums it up. And in another essay, he's giving out that it's not reality what's being discussed. He said, look, that's not reality. He says, reality is tax returns and who cooks dinner. Which it is. And then the other thing about his work is he's not afraid to take a crack at people who've achieved a great deal of success. Now, he doesn't do it gratuitously, but he certainly will point up writers who have produced books that aren't up to their usual standards. So, for example, the Annie Proulx novel Barskins, which is about deforestation, an important subject. what he says is, talk about a preachy book, as Homer Simpson once remarked of the Bible. So, you know, he really will have a pop where he feels it's deserved. But as I say, it's not gratuitous.
Yeah.
Ian McEwan is another, again, you know, kind of lauded writer. There's a story called Nutshell, which is recounted by a fetus. And he says that this is a riff on the Hamlet story. You know, the fetus hears
Yeah.
a murder plot from his mother. He says something seems to happen. This is Kevin now. He says something seems to happen to writers in late middle age, famous male writers in particular, he says. Phew. But he says they start to get wheezes, they fall for wacky notions, and they can no longer tell the difference between good ideas and bad.
Yeah.
So that's him on the McEwan story, Nutshell.
It's interesting because I suppose as a book, I'm thinking about, I mean, it was a very different book, but you know, Edward St. Aubyn's book about the prize jury, the book, it's kind of a parody really on the Booker Prize. And it's a brilliant book, but I think if you're a writer or in any way kind of engaged with the literary scene, you get a lot more out of it, because there is a lot of stuff that happens in terms of misunderstandings and miscommunications, and then kind of, and of course personalities and all of that kind of thing. And it's very, very funny. It's a comical kind of a story. But I guess the place of the writer within the kind of structure of publishing and everything is that there are editors, there are reviewers, there are readers, you know, and we need the kind of totality of that fabric for the work to exist, for there to be a reader, for there to be someone who might review it or critique it. I mean, writers themselves are always critiquing their work. Other writers sometimes critique the work. We all have first readers and people who will go over it. But he kind of says at one point, I think somewhere, about the reviewer, the critic is always kind of an optimist, or like you're saying, they come at it wanting to celebrate it, you know, that the act of coming to the piece is usually a love of the arts and the art, and wanting to kind of write about it and wanting to engage with it. And like you said earlier, the motivation of maybe a bad review sometimes being disappointment and not spite, you know, he does highlight that there is a kind of a love, I guess, an appreciation that is involved in the act of. But I think there are various ins and outs in the practice, I guess, of criticism. You know, I think fairness and a fair eye are very important in that process. And I do think we have a lot of very good reviewers and critics of work, but his essays do really highlight, I guess, the different personalities that are at play in this world, where it's all revolving around the writing and the art, but it's also about the lens, the different kind of perspectives, I guess, on the situation.
Well, he's always very readable, Kevin, whether he's writing a novel or criticism. It's interesting to see a talented novelist review a book, because they come at it from a different perspective, I think. Kevin is making the case that criticism inherently is an art, but never more so than when practiced by an actual artist, which he is. So it's worth mentioning that he's written 2 excellent novels, Bad Day and Black Rock, which was published to acclaim. And then he had this decade-long journey before his next novel was published, White City. He had writer's block, or the work he was doing wasn't up to standard. And I think that gives him a perspective on writing life, which not everybody else shares. And it's why I say that, yes, he can be mischievous, but he's never cruel. the criticism is usually deserved. And once the writer in question gets over his or her peak, they'll find if they take his advice, the next book will be better. You know, he's
Yeah.
right. Everybody
Yeah.
makes mistaken calls sometimes.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, what he's doing here is honoring the art of criticism.
Yeah.
I would certainly like to read more of his essays. I'd be interested in a collection of pure essays of Kevin's, because I find his worldview just fascinating. You know, it's the humor, but also he thinks very hard about something.
Yeah. Well, that's The Written World by Kevin Power, also published by Lilliput Press. We are going to finish up on Adrian Duncan's latest novel. And Adrian has very interesting work. I've been a fan of his for a long time. This is the book that we're going to look at. And
I have mine here.
he has written short stories and novels, and he's also got that great book on the Irish bungalow. Very interesting person, and again, I suppose no more than Kevin, very interesting perspective. So, do you want to introduce this novel, Martina?
So the narrator is a Russian geometer, and it's a novel about guilt, homesickness, the loneliness of exile. It's also about industrialization and about infrastructure being constructed as part of nation building, in the case of Ireland in the early years of the state. So the novel is about mechanized harvesting of peat in Ireland, told from the perspective of this Russian mathematician, the narrator, who's a Russian emigre hired by Bord na Móna, the Irish state-owned company based in Kildare. And he's helping to measure great swathes of land set for drainage. And then after weeks of tracing vast triangles across bogs and swamps and so forth, he receives an ominous letter summoning him back to the USSR.
Yeah.
And he's unnerved. I can't imagine why. And he decamps to a small island on the Shannon estuary to lie low. So I think what I find very relevant to know when I embarked on this novel, but it's not essential, is that Adrian Duncan was a structural engineer before becoming a visual artist and then an author. And that engineering side is certainly reflected here. I don't mean to suggest that it reads like an engineering textbook. I just mean that he's on solid ground with his engineering. And it's been a theme in his work. A previous novel, A Sabbatical in Leipzig, dealt with a retired bridge engineer. And then his debut novel, Love Notes from a German Building Site, dealt with, no surprises, a German building site. So there's also an intriguing character over and above the geometer in the title. You'll notice I'm trying not to say his name because I'm not convinced I can pronounce it correctly, but it seems to be Lobachevsky.
Yeah.
Any Russian members of the audience can immediately complain because I'm sure it's appalling. But there's another intriguing character, Rattigan, who is running the operation in Ireland, and he is a frightening man. He's the surveyor, and he confides in him that during the Civil War, he walked his brother out to the bog and put a bullet in his head. So it's interesting to see Ireland and Russia intersect here.
Yeah, and place. It's very interesting to see a novel that is rooted in and connected to even this idea of like the bogland and things that have happened in the bog, and the surveying task, you know, in some ways it reminds me a bit of like Rahel's translations and stuff like that, kind of loosely, in terms of the same ideas of people being somewhere where they're not necessarily meant to be, but then winding up having an experience with the landscape.
Yes.
And in this particular novel, that is the bogland and this island on the Shannon estuary. And I think there's something special in that, and the location and setting that he chose.
Well, yes, the landscape is very much part of the novel. We don't actually go to Russia, which I find an interesting decision on the novelist's part. I kept expecting to find myself in Stalinist Russia, but he's making a decision not to. And there's a section in it where he says that his emigre character is afraid to return there for good reason, but that he's still homesick and he's unable even to imagine his mother, because it feels wrong to conjure up her face unless he can do so in their own country. I find that fascinating. But for me, yes, it's for me, the bog is this extra character. The bog is all pervasive, and Ratigan is suppressing his feelings of guilt and perhaps grief for his brother beneath the machinery of industry. He's trying to use industry on the bog to cauterize the pain.
Yeah, yeah. Like you were saying earlier about Adrian's work, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, because it's something that struck me when I picked up his debut, and have noticed like throughout his later work, is what you say about the kind of engineering mind. I guess he is someone who's an artist, a writer, and was active in these contexts that he writes about. And I think that it gives his work, there's a kind of an edge and a clear structure in the way that he writes. There's a lot of intentionality, I would say, in Adrian's work. He has a very precise way of writing, and I was recently reading Midfield Dynamo, which he sets up in the formation of a football team, but within the stories there's the interconnectivity of different stories in the book, but they're abstract, but they're also quite definite. And I know that's kind of a contradictory thing to say, but I find in Adrian's work that's something that he seems to really nail and execute, is that he can create a kind of an air and an atmosphere, but his writing is actually very precise and very exacting. And I really enjoy that about his work. It's very clean. I've often mentioned his books to other people in the last few years, because he is based outside of Ireland. So sometimes I feel like, I guess we have so many books and so many writers being published. I wonder
Not
if enough
nearly
people
enough.
have found his books.
Not nearly enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's something else about there's a little writerly conceit which is great fun in the novel, which is that he uses the Russian style spelling of characters, and it took me a minute or two to see what he was doing, but then I loved it as I was going through it. So it's a Russian hearing Irish names and not recognizing them and writing down what he hears. So Colum is Kolim, and Potchin is Pjuteen or something, Tieen, something like that. It's reinforcing the narrator's foreignness.
Yeah.
It's also a sense of the past impinging on the present, always. Now, we can see it, for example, with Ratigan's story, but also they find a bog body chieftain, and he's been found felled by an axe from behind. So this idea of ancient sacrifice mirrors the sacrifice of Ratigan's brother.
Yes. And I guess like the bog bodies, and even things like the bog wood and preservation, there's something kind of strange about the place of the bog, in the sense that it can preserve things for a long time. And we can uproot, like bog oak and all of this kind of thing, and then people will know about, or at least Irish people, most people will know about the bog bodies. There was always a sense in some way of the boglands being places where things happened in kind of almost a liminal space, but like while things can kind of sink and be consumed, they're sort of preserved. And I guess even the bog has become so iconic in Irish culture, and the idea of, you know, even in recent years of the cutting away of the bogs, or Loch Burrow, where they've transformed like a lot of the peat land into a kind of a visitor experience, kind of a park. And it's, I found being in those places, walking around, you know, like the coastal landscape, like the forest, the bog has its own kind of an energy. And for sure there are images in this book.
Well, and
that
of
are very
course,
connected to that.
Irish people were called bog trotters by various waves of colonizers, because they literally could run across the bog in a way that, you know, in the Elizabethan settlers or soldiers couldn't. They didn't know the secret paths through the bog. And bog trotter, which perhaps, I don't know, maybe it was initially semi-admiring that they could navigate this treacherous terrain, then became used as a term of insult.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's Adrian's title, and all titles will be mentioned in the description on this video. But thank you, Martina, for joining me today to talk about these titles.
Oh, a pleasure. And can I say that they're all Lilliput titles, of course, the Lilliput Press, Anthony Farrell, who's the publisher, but there's also something you rarely come across with a publishing house. It has a shop in the publishing house where you can go in, people are working around you, there are books for sale, and also Lilliput mugs.
Yes. So I was just about to say, yes, if you're looking for these titles, it would be great to support Irish publishers. And like Martina has said, Lilliput do actually have their own shop if you're in Dublin that you can go in. They also have an online shop. And then many of these titles are also available from any good bookshop, so you'll find them there. Thank you to Lilliput Press, and thank you, Martina.
My pleasure. Thank you, Danny.